Wonderful. So we're going to go next to Dr. Baker.
Hi, everyone. I am just really delighted to be here. I'm very excited to talk about my book and have you learn more about it. I'll start with a little bit of background so that you know where I started and what brought me to writing this book. I'm originally from Suriname in South America, a very small country with, at this point, a little bit over 500,000 people. It's a very small population. And I lived there until I was about 20. And that's the time that I decided to move to the United States with my parents' blessings, who agreed that they were going to give me the opportunity to go abroad and study. But I want to give you a little bit of my background so that you can understand where the foundation of my book really comes from. And so Suriname is a very tiny country, and it started out as a colony from the Netherlands. And in 1975, it got its independence, and it was initially seemed like a nice idea, but quickly turned into some commotion and unrest, where eventually in 1980, the military took over. And that's when a lot of turmoil started, where we're talking about civil war, where people were afraid to even go on the street. There were shortages of food. I actually remember having to stand in line with a coupon, which basically entitled you to only get the items that were listed. And so you were able to get a little bit of rice, some oil, and some of the very basic necessities. And so that left a very deep mark on me and pretty much everybody who experienced it. It is something that, of course, rocks your foundation. People were going through times when, you know, some didn't even know where their next meal was going to come from because it was that difficult. The borders were closed at some point. And there was all the intimidation that you read about in stories about military coups when that happens, and you know, curfews where you're not even allowed to go on the street. Otherwise, you don't know if you're going to make it out alive, etc. So those were things that we lived. And I remember sitting on the balcony listening to, you know, gunshots. There was no radio station, so my father had to actually use a little transistor radio to get the news from the Netherlands so that we could find out what was going on in our own country. So I'm telling you all this because these are the types of things that kind of shape who you are, and they leave a mark. They leave quite an impression. And so it was one of the things that shaped who I ultimately became. That was in 1980, and then in 1982 there was another incident with the military. So politically it was very rocky. In 1984, I ended up losing my sister. My sister drowned. It was a very traumatic accident. Um, Now thinking back, she was such a hero as she was trying to save her friend. She lost her life. And that too was something that left such an impression and such a scar, because at that young age, I wasn't quite, you know, familiar with all the tools that I needed to get out of my trauma and stress. And I was young. I was very young. And my sister dying was really my first experience with death. And it came with such trauma because she drowned. So it was something that happened so suddenly, and it was so very traumatic. So you can imagine how my foundation was really affected by that. So I'm going to fast forward a bit because unfortunately, there were many more people I buried after my sister's death, uncles, aunts, grandparents, you know, eventually my father and friends, you know, you name it. And so those are people who passed away. And there were so many other hurdles that I overcame and eventually grew from. And the growth is something that, as I got older, I started to appreciate it more and more, because although death sounds like it's very traumatic, there is another side. If you can only kind of cross that path of, you know, hurt and pain and look on the other side, there's always something else there. And so I tell you all of this because I want to kind of introduce you to what my book is about. And I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint so that I can show you what the book is basically built on. And I've used a metaphor. And the metaphor really is where I have the reader make a comparison between their life and a house. And so Marianne said it so nicely earlier when she mentioned about my book. She said she never really thought about her life, herself as an architect of her own life. The name of my book is Building Blocks to an Abundant Life, Design the Life You Desire. And so this is really a book that gives you insights on other people's journeys, including my own, where I share with the reader just some practical ways of looking at things a little differently. So this is not a 10 steps on how to get a wonderful life at all. It's a book that offers opportunities for self-reflection. And as I just mentioned, there is a lot of sociology involved because I use the metaphor of a house. I am a sociologist. I am a professor of sociology, have been now for over 20 years. And so sociology is very deeply rooted in me. But those people who don't know nothing about sociology will still be able to understand the symbolism that I use. And so, for example, in each chapter, I highlight how you can compare a house and how you might want to rebuild it if it's not necessarily how you want it to be, and how you now can compare that to parts of your life. So, for example, I start out with the foundation, which I gave you my foundation to kind of just share with you how this can serve as a way for you to reflect and see, is there a crack in your foundation that you might want to take a closer look at and possibly try to repair? Because if you don't have a solid foundation, life is not going to be on solid ground. You need to figure out how you can maybe overcome some of the issues that might have been there caused by issues that are maybe genetic, or perhaps you had some problems in your family. Perhaps there was something in your culture that really caused you to have something that causes a block. So what I've done is I've invited people that are very close to me to share their story. And once I decided what the structure of the book was going to look like, I very carefully thought about who had a story that kind of related to the structure of a house. And again, the idea is to try to see if there is room for remodeling, right? So I would like the reader to reflect on the story and the chapter. And then at the end of every chapter, I give an opportunity for them to sit down and just really reflect, redesign, and hopefully remodel. What can you do to make some positive changes so that you can make your life more abundant? And so in the foundation chapter, I talk about something like culture, and someone shares a story about the impact that culture had on them. Some of the stories that were shared, and I have to tell you, I was moved by the vulnerability of the people that agreed to write their story. So for example, in the section on religion and spirituality, there is a story shared by Doreen, who lost her daughter. And she has given me permission to be honest and open about this. And this is really the story about my sister who died. Doreen is my mother. She's actually also attending today. So I just want to give a shout out to Doreen. But she very openly shares about the story of how my sister passed away. But then the resilience that comes out of it is really how she turned to religion and her faith to get her through this. And so while not all the readers will necessarily relate to each and every practical, piece that's shared, the idea is for you to reflect and see what it can offer you for self-reflection and growth. And I have another chapter on doors, and the doors are really a way for you to look to see what you allow in and what you don't. Is there something that's blocked? So someone shares a story about their divorce and how it made such an impact that it even gave them moments where they felt that they wanted to commit suicide. So it goes into the story of this particular person who overcame that hurdle and came out again on the other side. So the roof reflects like our finances and our insurance. We need a roof over our head. What are we doing to make sure that that is in place? So some tips are offered so people can kind of think about what are we doing. So I'm going to take you to the next slide, which shows you just some pictures that again can kind of get you to see the relationship between a house and your life. So in the picture on the left, you see things like you actually can see some pillars. Imagine that a pillar is ugly and you want to remove it. Well, sometimes pillars are essential. So you can't just say, well, I'm just going to get rid of a pillar here. And so pillars for me, I identified certain pillars that are important to me. But of course, everybody would have to figure out what the pillars are for them that are important. But I identified things like honesty and integrity, empathy, fairness, justice, kindness, and forgiveness. So if one of your pillars seems to be either broken or you feel that it needs to be replaced, then it's time to kind of dig deep and reflect and see, well, what can I do here to remodel my house? So every chapter, as I mentioned, ends with those three things: reflect, redesign, and remodel, where I give you some things to just kind of think about. So stories, additional stories that were shared throughout the book are on, in the chapter on rooms, there's a story on someone who was struggling with their sexuality and coming out. The chapter on pillars has a story on someone and how they dealt with cancer and the struggles that came along with that. Forgiveness is one of the pillars that I go into. And that's where someone shared their story about an intimate relationship and rape, sexual assault, and how they dealt with this. And then there's also a chapter on walls where someone talks about their career and how they had some struggles in the beginning and eventually they turned things around and became very successful. There's another story on health and someone who has a vision impairment. And they talk about how they were able to kind of deal with that and look at the bright side of things as well. So I can go on, but I know that we have a limited time. But as I mentioned, this is not a 10-step on how to have a wonderful life and be abundant. It really is a book about self-reflection, looking a little bit deeper, but really making a concerted effort to make changes so that your life can improve. And so while you might not necessarily do it the exact same way that are outlined in the book, hopefully you'll be able to reflect and come up with your own ways that work for you. So that in a nutshell is really what my book is about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Baker, for sharing with us. This is amazing. I think I've read every single book out there available on self-help and, redesigning your life and tips, 10 steps to do XYZ just to kind of hack the system and get faster to reaching my goals. But I've never seen this particular approach to it. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for going into your personal story and sharing the candid story with us, because that's very important to know and to acknowledge who we are, learn from our past, and redesign the future. So thank you.